Good afternoon, everyone. I am so glad to have everyone here today. And so we are excited to present to you a session in our mental health awareness series, The Struggle is Real. Here at Howard University, we like to affirm the strengths in the Black community. And so today we're going to speak to you regarding uh, a particular topic that's of special interest to us. Next slide, please. So I am Dr. Sandra Edmonds Crew, Dean and Professor of the Howard University School of Social Work. And I am here to join with my colleague, Dr. Claudia Thorne, who will introduce herself. But let me just tell you a little bit about myself. In addition to being the Dean of the School of Social Work, I have over 30 years of practice, really focused on working with older persons and their family. I consider myself an ethnogerontologist, meaning that I specialize in the area of older Black persons and or other ethnic minorities, particularly focused on the area of caregiving and family strengths. So again, I am excited to be able to share with you today, along with my colleagues, about our lived experiences. Dr. Thorne.
Thank you, Dr. Crew. I too am a social worker and assistant professor of social work at Coppin State University Department of Social Work. Within this context, I teach courses on aging and human behavior across the lifespan. I am an ethnogerontologist. I serve on the State Alzheimer's Council and co-chair the Family and Caregivers Committee, and had the lived experience of being a caregiver for two parents, one with Alzheimer's, and have conducted significant research on caregiving in Alzheimer's. So I'm very, very grateful to be here and to engage in this dialogue today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thorne. Next slide, please. So today we're going to talk about Alzheimer's disease in the Black family. And we are so grateful to blackdoctors.org for allowing us to participate in this series. As many of you already know, this is Alzheimer's Awareness Month in November. So we specifically chose this month to talk about Alzheimer's disease in the Black family and addressing mental health through lived experiences. So again, Dr. Thorne and I are both ethnogerontologists, but we're going to use a little autoethnography to talk to you about our family experiences as we think about Alzheimer's disease. And certainly it applies to other dementias, but we really do know that there is a differentiation. There are many dementias, and Alzheimer's is one of those dementias that we kind of talk about. But when we think about the Black family, we have a cultural richness and heritage that really provides us with context for thinking about um, health disparities. It provides us with a context of thinking about how we address the caregiving needs in our families. And some of you out there, like me, you did not self select as a caregiver. It became your responsibility, and you had to pick it up as you were going along. And Dr. Thorne and I have both had those experiences, and we thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to share some of our life lessons with you so that we can really get a sense of how we can improve the quality of life of those that we serve. So I think it's particularly important that we begin with some context. Next slide, Dr. Thorne, please.
So, yeah, so being Black, it's really important to know that African Americans and older Black Americans are more than twice as likely to have Alzheimer's disease. This is particularly important as we begin to approach population aging. We know that the African American population aged 65 years and older may grow from 2.7 million to 6.9 million by 2030. More than 10% of people of all races, Alzheimer's disease is equal opportunity. More than 10% of all people of all races who are over age 65 experience Alzheimer's. But for African Americans, it's particularly significant that we will experience more Alzheimer's, twice as much. This is particularly related as we look at what some of the research is stating, the experience of discrimination, institutional and structural racism over the life course. And that can be a contributing factor to the fact that African Americans are more likely to experience Alzheimer's. Inherent in this is a lifetime of inequality, lack of access to health care, experiencing discrimination in the workplace, and generally not having access to a lot of the information that can support making some of the changes that are necessary to improve wellness. And given that, we also have the experience of inherent bias. Half of African Americans say that they have experienced discrimination while seeking care for a person living with Alzheimer's. And only 48% of Blacks report being confident that they can access culturally competent care. Next slide, please. So, what really is going on? I think this is really important to understand what is going on with Alzheimer's and to begin to have these conversations within our community. I know at Coppin State University, in the classes that I teach, all of my students who are in the human behavior sequence become Alzheimer's champions. And they have these conversations in their communities, within their families, within their churches, so that family members can know exactly what Alzheimer's is and what Alzheimer's is not. So we can move away from that broad generalization, oh, grandma's just getting senile. So there's a distinction between mild cognitive decline and aging and what happens with Alzheimer's disease. So I'm going to focus specifically, in the interest of time, what happens with Alzheimer's disease. So if you ask anyone what is Alzheimer's disease, and everyone will say it's memory. So as we get older, sometimes we may forget things and remember them later. But in Alzheimer's disease, memory loss, especially forgetting recently learned information, to the point that it is disruptive, and it's disruptive in someone's life. The second sign is challenges in the ability to develop and follow a plan or work with numbers. People with Alzheimer's, some of the early signs may have problems following a familiar recipe, or keeping track of bills, or have difficulty concentrating. With normal aging, it's okay to make an error every now and then. The third sign is difficulty completing familiar tasks at home, trouble driving to a familiar location, managing a budget at work, or remembering the rules of a game. With normal aging, you need help with technology or managing the settings on the television. With fourth sign is confusion with time or place. People with Alzheimer's lose track of dates, seasons, the passage of time, and have trouble understanding something if it's not happening immediately. The fifth sign is their vision challenges, difficulty reading, judging distance, and determining color or contrast. The sixth sign is new problems with speaking and writing. People with Alzheimer's have problems joining a conversation. They may stop in the middle of a conversation and have no idea how to continue, or they may repeat themselves, or they may struggle with vocabulary. The seventh sign is misplacing things and losing the ability to retrace steps. With normal aging, you may forget some things, but if you pause and wait, you can reach for it. The eighth sign is increase uh, uh, poor judgment, experiencing changes in judgment and decision making. The ninth sign is withdrawal from work or social activities. And the 10th sign is changes in mood or personality. So, what I think is really important for caregivers is beginning to look at what are some of these signs, because it's not just memory, it's many of these signs that a person with Alzheimer's may exhibit. And if these signs are there, the first thing to do really is to seek medical attention, to have an assessment to determine what is going on. Next slide, please. Okay, so this, I believe, is when talk to others about understanding what Alzheimer's is. It's important to understand that it's not a psychological disease. Alzheimer's is a disease of the brain. As you can see, with the picture of the brain, here is a healthy brain, and then there is a brain with advanced Alzheimer's. So you can see over time, the brain with advanced Alzheimer's has atrophied and it has shrunk. And I'm going to share with you a story that really describes what's happening with Alzheimer's disease over the course of time. So I want you to think about a bookcase. I want you to think about a bookcase with books on stacked on in a bookcase, and we have four levels of the bookcase. And so what begins to happen is think about the brain as being very, very familiar to a bookcase, and over time, a person begins to lose books from the bookshelf. The first thing to go, as you can see, as indicated on the top shelf, is um, memories for facts and figures. On the top shelves are memories of facts and skills for thinking in complex or complicated ways. For people with dementia, the top shelf is damaged first. Skills like math, using language, keeping one's behavior in check are in this part of the brain. When dementia begins to rock the woman's bookcase, books on the top shelf begin to fall out. The woman may not remember what she ate for breakfast or that she has to pay for items at a bookstore. Emotions and feelings are lowered down on the bookcase, just like they are in the most innermost part of the brain. And that's where love, frustration, and sensing and respect reside here. The bookcase helps us to understand and explain how different skills, thinking skills, and memories affect dementia. So, in the beginning, someone loses thinking skills at first, but the emotional components of the brain remain. And that's why it's so important to be with our loved ones with love and respect and dignity. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Dr. Thorne. I really love that bookshelf analogy. So, when we are working with individuals and members of our family with Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, think about the bookshelf, think about the top shelf. And so, as you sort of process this, it really is very helpful to have that as an analogy so you can begin to see what's happening. Because often we go into panic mode because we see something isn't going well. So, let's just have just a short conversation about Alzheimer's disease and genetics. Um, So the question often is Alzheimer's disease genetic? What are the characteristics? Well, both Dr. Thorne and I have Alzheimer's in the family. So certainly we are interested in knowing what are the genetic um, aspects of this disease. And certainly some of you out there have the same kind of questions. Am I next? Am I destined to this situation that my parent, my sister, my sibling, other siblings experience? So we started thinking about how this presentation should address genetics. So we do know when we begin to think about genetics, there are two types of genes. And again, we are not medical doctors. We are social workers. But so our focus is on the biopsychosocial spiritual aspects of it. But I really wanted to at least present this to you to give you to help you think and process what it means. So the risk genes increase your likelihood of developing Alzheimer's or any other disease, but they do not guarantee it will happen. You have a higher risk. 40 to 65% of those diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease have the APOE 3 E3, E4 gene. I'm sorry, I stumbled over that. So we know that it really increases the likelihood of your risk, but it does not mean that you will have Alzheimer's disease. On the other hand, and that's true with all genes, not just with Alzheimer's, but deterministic genes, these are the genes that directly cause a disease, guaranteeing that anyone inherits this one will develop the disorder. And they're very, the research shows that deterministic genes only account for 1% or less of individuals' Alzheimer's disease. So when we think about testing and we really look at our family dynamics, what we would really mostly be thinking about are risk genes. Do we have a higher risk of others of developing Alzheimer's? But risk does not mean that one will develop it. So if you're looking at the second part of this slide, it says, is Alzheimer's genetic? It states that having a parent, brother, or sister with Alzheimer's increases your risk, but doesn't mean you will develop Alzheimer's. Now, I know, in the words of my grandmother, that's all well and good. However, if you have Alzheimer's in the family, you think about things like this. When you lose your keys, when you're my age, 72, you think, is this normal aging? Or is this a predictor that I am really going to experience what my mother and my grandmother experienced? And I'll talk a little bit about them more. But all of the literature is very clear that certainly there's a higher risk factor there, but risk does not translate to you will actually experience Alzheimer's disease as we begin to think about that. So, next slide, please. I want to sort of go back with our theme, the struggle is real. If you have Alzheimer's in the family, your struggle is real. And we're hoping this presentation today will help you to normalize your struggle, if that makes sense. Normalize your struggle because others have been through it. But we really want to be more aware in the African American and the Black community as to what this means to us. So, the Centers for Disease Control states that Black people are more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease than white people. So here's your first risk. The fact that you are African American or a member of the Black community, that you are more likely to experience Alzheimer's disease. We know that 14% of Black people in America over the age of 65 develop Alzheimer's disease as compared with 10% of white people. Now, what I would say, I teach research on occasion that when we're looking at 14%, there's like 86% that don't. So I don't want you to just look at the 14%, but let's think about the opposite. Most do not. Most do not. You have a higher risk if Alzheimer's disease is in the family, but it does not mean that there's a definite pathway to that. So, but what we do know, we know that social determinants of health, including the stress associated with trauma and racism, have something to do with the increased rate of Alzheimer's disease in the African American community. What we don't know the why of all of these, but we think at the School of Social Work at Howard, we have something the principles of the Black perspective. And one of the things that we focus on is not to give simplistic explanations to complicated phenomena. This is much more complicated than saying more Blacks than whites. It's much more complicated. It requires that we pay attention to culture and focus in on that. So, the why, we're still out there gathering data and research to understand what this really means for the Black community. But we do know that without regard to the causation, we have to address it if it presents itself in our family. And so we want you to be prepared to address it in a way that's affirming the strengths of a community, affirming our strengths as a Black community. Next slide, please. So when we begin to think about um, African Americans, older African Americans, we do bear a disproportionate burden. Did you notice I slipped in that we? I am a member of this community. So it is not something that I'm talking about, quote, those people. I'm talking about myself as we begin to think about this. And so we know that it is twofold higher among African Americans and compared to other minority and ethnic groups. So we have to really be aware, because if you are aware, then you really can begin to do something to address this. And we don't have to place ourselves in a situation where we are just waiting for a negative experience. We have power, the strengths perspective as we think about it. How do we use the strengths of the Black family to move us through the processes? Should a family member develop Alzheimer's, or should you develop Alzheimer's? So this is not just about other people. This is about you thinking about your family. And I've loved what Dr. Thorne has done with her students, that she said that she's made her students Alzheimer's champions. Isn't that a wonderful way of thinking about this? Being a champion of Alzheimer's, meaning that you understand it. You understand how it will present in your particular family. So the reasons, again, they're still largely unknown. It's not just genetics. Genetics plays a role, we suspect, but it's not just that. We talk about the social determinants and the cultural experiences of African Americans. Dr. Thorne and I come from very different environments, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But we both have Alzheimer's in the family. I'm from rural America, grew up in rural America. Dr. Thorne, tell them where you grew up.
I grew up in New York,
So we
and
come.
my parents are from the Caribbean. They're from Panama.
Okay. And
Hmm.
my ancestors were enslaved persons in Virginia. So our backgrounds are different culturally, but yet we found ourselves in the same, with the same dynamics. So we know among Black Americans ages 70 and older, 21% are living with Alzheimer's disease. You know what?
That's a
I want you
lot.
to focus on the living, though.
Mm.
I did not say suffering. I said living with Alzheimer's. And there is some pain that comes along with it. But again, we know that we're twice as likely to develop it than other racial groups. But we also know these social determinants are important. Higher rates of cardiovascular, heart disease may play a role. Really, really important. that we pay attention to the health and socioeconomic status. We heard so much about this during the pandemic, and I have coined the term IPEX, the impact of the pandemic experience. What we know from the impact of the pandemic experience is that it sort of unveiled the health disparities that were already out there. And it showed that we were more at risk. So part of it is really paying attention to what's going on in our family. And one of the things that's going on relates to Alzheimer's. So again, it's really important that we think about this. Next slide, please. So there's something that we think about that's called fear, dementia worry. I mentioned, if you lose your car keys when you're my age, and you know that your mother and your grandmother had Alzheimer's disease, what do you start thinking about? Oh, if you can't remember a name, or if you can't remember something, then your mind does think about, what does this really mean? But fear, anxiety, and it's really called dementia worry, where we really begin to worry more about the areas, rather than really taking positive action and affirmative action. So there is evidence that the individuals suffer from depression, when they feel that they are aging, and they may have be subject to Alzheimer's disease. And the reason their fear is there, if anyone has watched a loved one go through this, Dr. Thorne showed you the sort of channels of things that began to happen, where people lose spatial integrity in their thinking, where individuals don't know their names. Often people would say to me, does your mother know who you are? And my answer would always be, I know who she is. So I can remember for both of us and doing with that. But the anxiety over the loss of memory, the loss of being able to know that Claudia is my daughter, or to know that, oh, that's my son, and the stigma. Families, others looking in and saying, oh my goodness, something's wrong with grandma, or we don't want to take grandma or mom out because individuals will note that things are not quite okay. So anyone who's had Alzheimer's in the family understands the stigma associated with it. We don't concern ourselves by saying that somebody has hypertension. We can feel comfortable with that kind of diagnosis, but to say that someone has Alzheimer's, we used to think about it as senility. We people would think we use terms like that were derogatory terms, and so there was the stigma associated. People will use all kinds of ways of describing a person who did not have strong brain health, as we're thinking about it. The effect on the family can be traumatized by this. Your work schedule, everything can go in a different direction. The loss of the sense of purpose as you watch a person decline, that, things that they were really great at, all of a sudden there's no interest in those things. And how do you think about how you will care for your loved ones? We tend not to prepare for it because we're always holding on to the thought processes that it's going to escape me. So therefore, as much as we know professionally, Dr. Thorne and I, we still had that moment of reckoning that this is not about what's in our textbooks. This is about what's in the family. So as we begin to think about how we address the fear, it's really important. It is quite normal to really have these thoughts, quite normal. What we want to think about is, what do we do with these thoughts so that it doesn't negatively impact our mental health? So again, this series is a part of our SAMHSA, a session on mental health in the Black community. The struggle is real. So we wanted to kind of share with you this information that you will have an understanding that we are in this together. And if I could create a new theme, it would be we are in this together. So Dr. Thorne, next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crew. Um, so, keeping in alignment with the strength perspective and an empowerment perspective, what is it that we can do? Who can we be in the face of Alzheimer's in the family? How can we not just crawl under a bed and let fear or depression or anxiety take hold? But what is it that you can do to control many of the risk factors? Because there are things that we can do. And I know I've been to the doctor, and the doctor was really, really very, very clear. Okay. A lot of it comes down to diet and exercise and reducing stress. And so, diet within a cultural context can be very interesting. And so we have to look at those foods that we traditionally enjoy that may be high fat and high sugar and modifying those foods. We can modify what we put in our greens. We can modify from using pork, which has a very, very high content in greens, to using smoked turkey and so many other different flavorful and delightful flavors. And I think the diet is when you're looking at diet, modifying it. It doesn't mean that you can never have fried chicken or you can never have certain things, but maybe allowing yourself that macaroni and cheese or fried chicken every now and then. Get an air fryer. Air fryers make delicious, when seasoned, delicious fried chicken, and you eliminate all of the grease. So it's modifying your diet and also modifying the diet within a cultural context. There is vegan butter and vegan cheese, less fat, tastes delicious. Exercise. Let's think about exercise as movement. Does not necessarily mean going to the gym and working out 5 days a week, but doing that walk, walking through the neighborhood. You like to dance? Dance. Exercise has to be incredibly enjoyable in order for you to continue to do it as a new behavior. You can control what's happening with your brain by keeping your brain active. For people who are older, technology presents its challenges. As I say to many of my more mature students, you can do this. You got this. You can just learn a new skill at a time. Read. Do puzzles. Do anything to keep your brain active so that it doesn't shrink. You want to keep your brain radiating and active, and you want to keep those circuits connecting and moving. Social isolation is a huge factor with aging, particularly among Black women, because as we get older, we tend to live alone. So staying connected to friends and family and neighbors and know who's in your community and participate in groups so that people know who you are and you know who they are. You have something to offer and you have something to receive by just having lunch, going out, walking with friends, calling up people on the phone. Maintain those social connections. It does get a little bit more challenging to make new friends as we get older because we may get set in our ways, but continue to reach out because that really also supports cognitive enrichment. The stress is huge. Forget the multitasking. Research has shown that multitasking, keeping 5, 10 balls in the air, it's not healthy. So you want to reduce your stress and learn some stress reduction techniques. You want to take your time. You want to do one thing at a time and do it well. You want to learn to meditate, to do deep breathing, to stretch, to do yoga, to read your affirmations, and depending on your spiritual practice, engaging deeply in that, knowing that there is a higher power for you to rely on to reduce stress. And then if you smoke, this is huge, to quit smoking. And what's so very interesting about the controllable risk factors for dementia are these are the same controllable risk factors for so many things. So you want to always reduce the fat, eat plenty of green vegetables, eat plenty of fresh fruit, drink lots of water, exercise, stay active, and keep your stress down and connect with people. Do what it impacts will impact dementia, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, straight across the board. So thank you. Next slide.
Thank you. Before you leave this slide, I want you to pay attention to the couch potatoes.
Uh,
That's a really important study, but think about it, that really engaging in exercise, whether it's about exercise when you go about doing your things, that's exercise, or whether it is really cardiovascular exercise, you can reduce the risk of developing dementia by a whopping 50%.
mhm.
Now, that seems like a pretty good bet in terms of doing this. And because I was doing this session today, I made sure I had my water here so that I could demonstrate really positive and affirming behavior rather than to focus on the negatives. What can I do? What can we do within the Black family? Next slide, please. So let's really think about the big picture approach to this. As I was preparing for this session, I ran across a wonderful article that talks about the link between sugar and Alzheimer's disease. Well,
Mm,
coming right off of Thanksgiving, a lot of us have some work to do to get rid of those calories. But even something like sugar, and we won't even talk about how sugar has impacted the Black family from our enslaved ancestors, how sugar has been a negative in our lives. But let's look at the big picture approach. Should we think about screening? It really is a matter of personal choice. As Dr. Thorne has said, that sometimes you will consult your medical provider to really get guidance there. Not sometimes, you should always consult your medical provider to kind of think about, what are you feeling? What's driving your need to get screening? Going back to those original that earlier slide that talked about what are some of the signs and symptoms of dementia, really being able to self assess the difference between aging and dementias as we think about it. Sometimes, if you engage in screening, it can ease the anxiety, but sometimes it can promote anxiety. So it has a lot to do with you as a person. It's whether or not you really want to engage in the screening process. But what we do know, the screening should be about really thinking about how do you enhance your quality of life, not about engaging in fear. So, but fear can also promote healthy lifestyles, like reading so much about it. I'm going to have my water more regularly. I'm going to skip perhaps, that candy bar that's on my desk. I'm going to be a little more mindful about those kind of things. So, we want you to kind of think about screening as a way of promoting healthy lifestyles, not as a way of being diagnosed with something that the literature states that you are not going to be diagnosed with being having Alzheimer's disease at a later age. It certainly will tell you your risk factors. And some of us already know those risk factors, right? Because we're trying to work on them as we speak. Now, that's a photograph there, and I'm going to segue into my mother and myself. My mother suffered with Alzheimer's disease as well as my grandmother. So I have a strong history in the family. But mother and I are at a restaurant there, and you will begin to see that both of us are having our cup of coffee. In terms of doing that, I have no sleeves on because I'm feeling a little warm. Mother is freezing. So, really trying to adapt the different lifestyles that come with that. So, next slide, let me tell you just a little bit more about Miss Thelma. Miss Thelma was my mother, and she passed in 2016. But here's a picture of uh, us together in 1992. My grandmother, Miss Becky, and my mom, Miss Thelma, and me. And we're there with my grandmother, who's in a nursing home because she's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. But we are there, with each other as family. And neither one of us are thinking necessarily then about whether or not we will develop Alzheimer's. We're thinking about caring for Grandma Becky at this point because Granddaddy was not uh, going to allow us to really provide treatment that he thought would separate him from his wife of many years. So Granddaddy passed taking care of grandmother. Grandmother again lived to be in her mid 90s. Granddaddy passed at 80 because he was struggling with the caregiving of my grandmother who was there. The next photo is my mother as we continued our weekly restaurant visits. And so I began to see this wandering look, this stare that really I could begin to associate it with Alzheimer's disease because of my professional training. But again, I was able to connect both at that moment when I'm there and I said, there's something about this staring off. Um, and then during this time, my mother would often say, when she had those moments of clarity, Sandra, if I have what my mother had, I want you all to take care of me in the way that you know how to do that. But those were very rare moments because usually it was the battle was on. The struggle was real when I would say to mother, you have cognitive decline or Alzheimer's. She did not accept it. And she really reminded me that I was the one with the problem. So constantly, she reminded me that I was the one who was stealing her money. I was the one who was taking her car keys. I was the one who was really negatively influencing her life. For an example, my sister took mother to New Jersey with her, and they were in a hotel. And lesson here: if you ever travel with a person who has Alzheimer's, make sure that you note that they are in the hotel room. So my mother gets out of the hotel room and she tells the state police that her daughter Sandra in Maryland dropped her off here, and she doesn't know what was wrong with me, but she remembered to give them my number to tell them. So those are the things that really happen with families. And that's me and my mom. We were doing the Roaring Twenties at her 90th birthday. Remember, celebrating the strengths. And then 2016, when she passed. This was the last Mother's Day picture. So this autoethnography really invites you to know a little bit more about my experiences. Dr. Thorne?
Thank you, Dr. Crew. So many similarities. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, well, as we wait for the next slide, let me share a little bit about my story. There we are. And so in this picture, you see my mother, Carmel Thorne, born in Panama, migrated to the United States in the 1940s to attend college. And you see her and my father. They were married for 63 years prior to his passing. What I came to realize is that also I began to notice some changes in my mother. And I think that's why it's so important for people to know what some of the signs and symptoms are that indicate that there's some kind of change. So I began to notice some things that were very, very different. For example, during one Thanksgiving dinner, she was telling jokes, and it was so out of the context of the conversation that we were having as a family. And because I am a social worker and an ethnogerontologist, my signs went up. And I just really started looking and observing. And I had to be very careful because my mother is very, very feisty, and she was a social worker as well. And so I began to collect data. I started asking questions of her and just observing and asking questions of my father and asking questions of the neighbors. And finally, I said to her very gently one day, Mom, I really think that you may want to consider having a memory test. There's nothing wrong with my memory. I'm strong. I get up every day. I know what I'm doing. Mom, you may want to consider having a memory test. She was still resistant. And I listed all the things that I observed. And she said to my father, write down everything she's saying. I'm going to the doctor tomorrow. And I said to her, you want to get this checked out because you do not want to be like your sister. My mother has five sisters, and there are five with Alzheimer's disease. As daddy began to take sicker, the Alzheimer's became more pronounced. And it was very, very obvious that had been holding things together, um, and keeping their independence afloat. Once he could no longer hold things together, the Alzheimer's became full blown. Okay, full blown. For the signs of forgetfulness, being very, very agitated, not remembering a lot, repeating herself incessantly. And so he died, which he still, in many cases, did not remember after he passed, did not remember going to his funeral, do not remember who was in attendance at the funeral. And so I moved her closer to me because she was living in Florida and was placed in assisted living. She, of course, it was confusing for her because she wanted her home, she wanted her husband. She did not know where her husband was and how come he is not here. There were things in her life that she wanted to hold on, and it began to slip away and slip away. And eventually she passed. She passed in 2019. And so I was intensely caregiving of someone with Alzheimer's for about 5 years. In the meantime, very aware of the risk factors for the family. Every time we have cousins that have Alzheimer's, we have her sisters that have Alzheimer's, and obviously there's something in the family. So a few years ago, I started taking proactive measures and self medicating myself with a lot of vitamins to support memory and energy and things like that. And I noticed one day I was at a conference and I was walking and I was a little unbalanced. And I'm like, this is concerning me. I've been, mentioning this to my doctor for a while, and she kind of blew me off. I'm getting older, things happen. And I said, no, something is wrong. And self advocated to go to a neurologist and self advocated to go to my mother's neurologist because I was like, oh my goodness, this is it. This is the big Alzheimer's. What am I going to do? And so I went to my mother's neurologist and had the battery of tests. What I found out that I had from taking so many vitamins was B6 toxicity, and it mimics many of the symptoms of Alzheimer's. It was immediately treatable. But what was really good is that I had a whole slew of tests done and particularly had the baseline established. And I was just very relieved to find out that it was not Alzheimer's. I'm better now. I stopped taking all of the over the counter medicines. But I think what's particularly important is to advocate for yourself, to know your own body, to have a doctor that's very, very proactive about many of the illnesses related to aging, as well as how to keep you healthy. Um, uh, and so and so the doctor said, well, one of the things I said, do I need to be tested, genetically tested? And she said, no, with your background, you don't need to be genetically tested, but what you do need is to begin to make some changes in your lifestyle. You need to, as I mentioned earlier, go for the Mediterranean diet, exercise, drink lots of water, no alcohol whatsoever, it's neurotoxic, plenty of green vegetables, manage your stress. And with really, because there are other things that people who are 70, they do have besides Alzheimer's. So it's important to just really be proactive and screen for anything, any new symptom or sign that emerges. Get immediate help and find out what it is. I think so often we tend to pray and hope it will go away. That's not we tend to hope and pray it goes away. So I just wanted to say that that is the what has been my experience as a caregiver for someone with Alzheimer's. Okay, what's also important to know is that there will be many trying moments and there will be many funny moments that you can laugh at later as the person that you love and know changes. And there's so many stories that I can tell. And I'm going to tell one story. And I think this is just a hysterical story. Now I think it is. So I took my mother to a new church close to where she was living. My mother had regular visitors all the time. And I took her to a new church. Wasn't my church. And we started going. And after about the third visit, and we would always sit in the front row, she started losing weight, and I had to take her rings from her. So she's asking me repeatedly in the front row, where are my rings? Where are my rings? Where are my rings? I'm like, Mom, they're at the jeweler's being resized. She said, I want my rings. Mom, they're at the jeweler's being resized. I want my rings. She yells out, new church. I don't know anybody at this church. Call the police. My daughter stole my rings. And she says it over and over again to this pastor who I do not know, comes down to the pulpit, from the pulpit, to say, ma'am, can I help you? And after my mother started talking, the pastor looked at me and said, oh, she has Alzheimer's. I'm like, yeah, she does. And everyone was very understanding. But I think what we need to know, number one, to laugh at some of these behaviors. Eventually, she did get her rings back, but to laugh at it and to have a community that is aware of the signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's, so both the caregiver and the person living with Alzheimer's can be supported. So that's just the story for me. Love, take care of yourself because there are many risk factors for caregivers. Okay, thank you. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thorne. And we
Mhm.
can just go directly to the resources. So we want you to know that there's help out there. It is not simply where we went through this ethno experience so that you could really understand that we've been through it and we're all going through it together. So when we think about Alzheimer's, there's the Alzheimer's Association that has a 24/7 helpline, and it's on the screen. There's also Dementia Friends in the USA. They too have a resource for you. It's Us Against Alzheimer's, and that's African Americans that we are really going to take this on. And certainly, blackdoctor.org has some wonderful resources for you. And I want to reemphasize there's a 988 SAMHSA National Helpline because sometimes it does impact one's mental health when you are a caregiver. So we wanted you to have these resources available to you because sometimes the best strategy is to talk it out with someone. One of the things that Dr. Thorne said that was really, really critically important is that, you know, the more other people know about Alzheimer's, they can be a partner in helping with the caregiving. So the church was able to recognize the symptoms. So it is
Mhm.
our responsibility to share that with you. We have appreciated this opportunity to speak with you about our own experiences using autoethnography to kind of share our stories. But what we like also is for you to take a moment, and I think my colleague is going to put the code on the screen. If you can sort of give us some feedback, we'd like to know if this was a beneficial session for you, and so please take a moment and share information with us about your experience with this session and any other information that if you'd like more sessions, a part two of this, we would be more than delighted to share that with you. So thank you very much. It has been our pleasure to share our stories with you. And once you have Alzheimer's in the family, then you become a better person because you recognize the value of the quality of life and always remember those funny stories that get you through. So thank you so much. Uh, if there are a few questions, we might be able to answer. I know we're coming to the end of our time. So again, we encourage you to think about Alzheimer's in the Black family. And if there are things that we can do as a community, then we want to make sure that we are prepared for that and that we embrace the person rather than stigmatize the person because there are lessons to be learned with the powerful stories that they leave us with. Again, I mentioned my mother would have moments of clarity, and that's when I would get the guidance from her, how she wanted to be cared for. But now is the time to get that information from your loved ones. What do they want? It's a part of end of life care and thinking about that. What is it
Mhm.
that they would like? Sometimes in the Black family, you know, we are take on a fatalistic view. Whatever will be, will be. But it's an opportunity for us to use it as family time to talk with our loved ones, our family member about what's going on. Really, really important. Um, that there's a question: is it true that trauma can trigger early onset? I've not seen any literature that states that trauma can trigger early onset, but I can't say that it's not factual. But I'm not, all the literature I've read has really generally talked about social determinants being more of the driver than trauma. But again, Alzheimer's can be at an earlier age too, and we have just focused mostly on older persons. Uh, Claudia, Dr. Thorne, do you have any insight on whether trauma?
Now, I think what we're looking at is generational trauma and the generational trauma that's related to systemic oppression and discrimination. And so that we do know, but I have not read individual trauma and how that carries out.
Well, thank you for the person who submitted that. You'll give us something to talk about next time we see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.